Reviewing energy relationships within organisms. Before that, we reviewed reproduction of organisms. And those two things, those two key concepts in biology, are going to define a lot of the ways that organisms interact, not only with each other, but within groups of the same organisms. And these organisms and their relationships are collectively referred to as ecology. So sometimes you're going to see the word ecology coming up in the next few weeks. And it's not something new. It's a new way to look at the things we've been talking about all year. And we're going to start off with biotic and abiotic factors. If you remember, we started the year with a little walk around the nature trail looking for things that were living or once living, the biotic ones, and abiotic factors, the things that were never alive. Because living things need some of those non-living things to survive, and they can get them in very complex ways, and that works in what we'll call communities and ecosystems. So our objectives for this first section are to be able to explain the difference between abiotic factors and biotic factors. And I think you have a pretty good handle on the difference between living and non-living things. Now, we did do some exercises where it makes it a little confusing because we don't have a good definition for life. We have a checklist to go through, but you still know the difference between living and non-living things. So from there, we'll go to describe the different levels of biological organization that biologists and scientists use to keep things straight and to get us all using the same common language so that we can talk to each other and to other scientists. And an important thing to take away from this first part is a difference between a habitat and a niche. And we'll get into that in a little while. So there is a lot of vocabulary as we're getting into a new way to look at what we've already been looking at. So we're talking in general about ecology, which is the study of how organisms interact with their environments. The biggest environment you can talk about is the whole planet. And the whole planet's not really a good explanation because there's a very small part of this planet that life is capable of surviving in. We're going to call that the biosphere. The biosphere is a huge ecosystem, and an ecosystem will include both the biotic factors and abiotic factors in it. And there are some major groups of ecosystems that we're going to refer to as biomes. Within those biomes and within those ecosystems, there are going to be biological communities, and those biological communities are going to interact with each other in many different ways, including predation. Some will hunt others. Symbiosis. Some organisms need or use other organisms nearby. One form of symbiosis is called mutualism, where both benefit. Another is called commensalism. And the third we'll look at is parasitism. Within the biological communities, there are groups of one single type of organism and a group of one single type of organism, like all the humans in an area, all the rabbits in an area, are called a population. And those populations have habitats, which we've been describing above, and they will also have jobs to do in that habitat, which is called a niche. So don't get overwhelmed with all the new words. They really describe concepts that we've worked with all year long or that you have had before. So again, ecology is the study of the interactions between organisms and their environment. Environmental science is a little different than that. It contains elements of biology with a lot of ecology, but it also includes geology, chemistry, physics, geography, oceanography, climatology, even economics. So we are going to look at ecology. Some of you in the future will take a course called environmental science, which is a lot of ecology and very important, but it includes a few other things as well. So humans are part of the natural world. We interact with our environment. We rely on a healthy environment. We need the environment. We need food, shelter, water, and air. And we also need to be aware of our impact on the environment. Biggest possible ecosystem we can talk about is the biosphere. And the biosphere we could sum up as planet Earth, But it's really not the whole planet Earth. It's a very narrow layer of the planet. And as far as we know, this is the only one in the universe, the only place where life exists in the universe. So all ecosystems include biotic factors and abiotic factors. Biotic factors are those things that were once alive or are alive currently. Abiotic factors are things that are not alive. Some of those will be required by biotic things to survive, and some of them will have an influence on biotic factors. So if we look at the levels of organization within the planet, we describe biospheres, the biosphere, which is the largest. It is the collection of all the others. Within the biosphere, there are biomes. Those are large areas with similar climate conditions. And if they have similar climate conditions, they're going to have similar types of organisms, because one of the things organisms adapt to are climate conditions. Within those large areas, there are localized areas called ecosystems, and within those ecosystems, there are the living things, which we call the biological community. That would all be all the organisms interacting with each other. And within those communities, there are populations, which would be only one species of a particular organism. And within that population, there are individuals, and those individuals we would refer to as organisms. So in general, an organism, the group of organisms, makes up a population. All the populations in a particular area make up a biological community, and all the places where we have similar communities are called ecosystems, and they are grouped into some major types of ecosystems called biomes, and then the biomes collectively make up the biosphere. So let's look at the smallest system for most ecologists or people who study ecology, and that would be an individual, one organism. You can look at how that organism meets its survival needs. You can look at things like behaviors, you can look at its habitat, you can look at its niche. And if we pick a guppy, very simple tropical fish, and actually that picture is not a guppy, but it needs a minimum of 5 gallons, but 10 gallons are recommended. If you went to the store and bought it, you would get recommended for beginning aquarium people, because it's easy to take care of. It needs water conditions that include a pH between 6.5 and 7.2. The mineral amount in the water can be from soft to a little hard. It needs temperature ranges of 65 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit, and it will reach a maximum size of about 2.5 inches. So those are all information about a single member of a species, and that we would refer to as an organism. The next level up from that would be a population. How many of those guppies are there in a particular area? So we describe all the organisms of the individual species, and we focus on the place where that particular population lives. So in this case, we have a population that was found in a fish tank, and it looks like we have 1, 2, 3, 4 of these fish in the fish tank. The next thing we would do is look at all the living things in the tank or in the system. So here we have plants, we have some moss growing on the sides, algae, that's the word I'm looking for. So we look at plants, animals, and things we can't see without a microscope, microorganisms. Anything that's alive in this tank is going to be part of that biological community. And that biological community is going to represent competition for whatever population we're looking at, but it's also going to represent resources for the organism we are looking at. And they are going to compete for things like spaces and food, oxygen, for plant, carbon dioxide. Now there are more than just living things in this tank. we've got these stones, got oxygen being bubbled in or air being bubbled in. Those are resources that these populations have to compete for, nutrients that these populations have to compete for. They will help define the kind of camouflage that works best so that you can hide from predators. They provide, these other things provide shelter for the organisms. And you wouldn't have it so much in a fish tank, but there's also things like weather and climates that are going to be important in most ecosystems. So the interactions within an ecosystem would include the habitat. That's the area where an individual or a population live. So that fish tank would represent a habitat. And the niche represents a job that that population does for the ecosystem. So the fish within that fish tank, one of their jobs would be to keep the amount of plant life, algae, to a minimum. So you might get an algae eater for a fish tank. So some of those things that niches can be would include predators. Predators would hunt other organisms within the system. Those predators would help keep a balance in the number of organisms within a particular community. Decomposers are important for breaking down organisms that have died and the components need to be recycled so that other organisms can use them. Producers, we talked a lot about. Producers produce glucose to feed all the other organisms, as well as oxygen so that we can have aerobic respiration occur. And this is all because all living things need to have the same basic things. They need to have oxygen if they are aerobic organisms. They are multicellular organisms with mitochondria. They need to have carbohydrates to make ATP. And they need shelter. And how they get these things is going to determine how they interact with each other. So we have to deal with competition. The amount of oxygen, the amount of carbohydrates, even the amount of shelter in an environment is limited. And each population and each organism within a population has to compete for those things: oxygen, carbohydrates, and shelter, and anything else they need to survive. And there are different ways you can compete. So predation, one organism feeds off another organism. The organism that is eating the other organism is called a predator. The one that is eaten is called the prey. So we have predator-prey relationships in predation. Symbiotic relationships are ways that organisms interact with each other that don't require the death of one of the pair. So a predator eats a prey, the prey is dead. In mutualism, a symbiotic relationship, both organisms are going to benefit from the relationship. In commensalism, one is going to benefit, the other one doesn't really care, it's just there. In parasitism, one is going to benefit, the other is going to be harmed, but it usually doesn't die from the infection. So ecology is the branch of biology in which interrelationships between organisms and their environments are studied. The levels of organization in ecological studies would include an individual, a population, a biological community, an ecosystem, which would be made up and which would make up biomes, which make up the biosphere. Abiotic and biotic factors are going to shape an ecosystem and determine the communities that will be successful in it. And symbiosis is a close relationship that exists when two or more species live together. That's two, not toe. All right, thank you. I will post a Chalk Talk and assignments tomorrow for this